Thank you for paying attention and staying awake this morning. I do appreciate it. John chapter 12 is where our lesson will be drawn from this evening. John chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. But if your family was anything like mine, dinner was important. Supper time made a big difference in our family. It was very important to us to be together around the table, and I just remember so many things from dinner. I was taught so many things, how to pray at the dinner table. I was taught the meaning of a great number of words that I was mispronouncing, that I was reading out of books. But my father and mother made sure that those things were corrected. I learned not to smart off to my father at the table as well. I learned a lot of things. I think the greatest thing I ever learned at the table was how to eat burned biscuits. My father never complained once that I recall the entire time about my mother's cooking. Every meal was complimented, every single one of them. And I mentioned that to my mother while we were just reminiscing a while ago, and a year or so ago, and she said, "Well, you should have seen his mother cook. She only had one way to cook, turn the stove on all the way, and to moderate the heat, she lifted the pan off just like it was an old wood stove." And so he'd eaten a lot of burnt biscuits. I took over all the cooking chores when we got married, and your daddy was still in the military, and I did all the cooking. Nano did not do any more cooking, and so I really feel honored that she took my fish. I caught about a 6-pound carp. We didn't eat carp in my family, but I wasn't letting Uncle Bill throw that carp back in the river. And she cooked that up, eggs and all, and it was just and Nano cooked it. I didn't realize how precious that was. Dinner. How many precious memories do you have from dinner? Isn't that where your life came together? Where you learned so much of what life was really like? Well, here we have one of the last chances Jesus has to relax at supper. In John chapter 12, you realize John chapter 13 is all in the upper room, the evening before Jesus is going into Gethsemane that night. Here in John chapter 12, we see one of the last chances Jesus has to relax. He has already been condemned to death. I know the trial hasn't taken place, but in chapter 11, verse 57, we see the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, they should report it, that they might seize him. In fact, the statement's been made, it's better for one to die for the nation. So this is a very short reprieve for Jesus. Let's sit down with him at table, and let's have supper with Jesus for a few minutes. Then, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. Then one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, "Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" This he said not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always." Well, I learned how to compliment my wife's cooking. I learned to watch my tongue at the table with my father. Let's see what we can do with our elder brother. What does Jesus teach us in this passage? If time permits, I've got 5 lessons. First, if the devil has anything to do with it, and it's the devil we're talking about, notice verse 5. Notice verse 5. Here, Read that to yourself again, did you? 300 denarii. If it's up to the devil, no good deed will go unpunished. No matter how deep the sacrifice, no matter how loving the gesture, the devil's got a way to gripe about it and fuss about it and make us feel terrible about it. If the devil's got anything to do with it, he's going to bring us down. We shouldn't be too surprised. In that upper room, Jesus is going to continue to talk about this idea. Slip over to John chapter 15, just a few pages, and look at verses 18 and 19. Jesus said, well, they said to him, John 15, 18 and 19, Jesus said, if the world hates you, you know, it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet, because you're not of the world, because I chose you out of the world, therefore, the world hates you. Oh, there's a lot of other passages saying the same thing to us. We shouldn't be surprised. 1 John chapter 3, verses 11 through 13 says that we're going to be hated. Philippians 1:28 is going to tell us just the same, that they're just, we can't be scared of them. We can't be terrified by these adversaries. The fact that there are adversaries is just an evident proof of perdition, but to you it's salvation. Philippians chapter 1, verse 28. They have to fuss about us. They're going to fuss. You only fuss about those that are different than you. Right? And we're different, especially if we're doing it right. They are surprised that we're not still running with them in the same excess of riot, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 4. Who gave Paul the thorn? You know about the thorn. He talks about all those terrible things that had happened to him and being shipwrecked, and really the worst, the topper of the whole list is being in trials among false brethren. But he starts talking about the thorn. Is it a messenger of the Lord sent to buffet him? Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 7, it was a messenger of Satan. Judas is not the only one the devil will use to try and criticize good things. And if you're being criticized, I'm not suggesting that it's just to be organized, just to be ignored. There may be a real good reason that a good faithful brother or sister is bringing out that needs to be corrected, needs to be changed. We ought to be open to listening, to constructive criticism and improving things. But don't forget, if you're going to do something, you're going to get criticized, and maybe quite harshly, in a way that if the devil can do it, he'll discourage. Second lesson. Who's this fellow who's saying this? Look at verse 4. What's coming along? He's the one who will betray him. Remember, come away from this table and know big sins start with little ones. They don't start with big sins. You don't just decide one day, I'm going to betray Jesus. I bet there's 30 pieces of silver in it for me. No. Judas started that road a long time before. He'd been dipping his hand into the money bag all along. He already had taken it into his heart, evidently, to do that long before he did it. Remember, we don't have any idea how long Adam and Eve enjoyed the garden before somebody looked, saw that it was good for food, wanted it, and took it. Right? It was a while, evidently. But it didn't just start by saying, hey, the Lord said, no, I guess I'll have to do that right now. Seems that way to me in my classroom sometimes. Mr. Graham says, don't do that. That's what I have to do next. But no, they had to have a little encouragement. And it wasn't just eating the banana or the apple or the pear or whatever it was. They had to look. When do we exhort one another? Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13. Exhort one another while it is called today, lest any of us be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Sin's a process. It doesn't just overwhelm us all at once. Instead, we've got to admit to ourselves, we can't say that the Lord's tempting me, but you have to say to yourself, I am tempting myself. I'm drawn away by my own lusts and enticed. And what's the process from James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15? Lust, when it's conceived, brings forth sin. And sin, when it's mature and full grown, kills you every time. Brings forth death, spiritually first. But sin tends to bring forth death in all kinds of ways. We started with just one sin in the Garden of Eden. Somebody ate the wrong fruit. And before a few generations were gone, God could only find one man, his family, 8 souls to save, and the rest of humanity, God said the thoughts of their hearts are only evil continually, right? Sooner or later it gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. David never should have been up on his balcony that night, up on his rooftop that overlooked the rest of the town. And if he had seen a woman getting ready for a bath, it was time to avert your eyes. But no, he kept on watching. He sinned, and he covered. It grows. It grows and grows and grows. And like David, we've got to turn away from it. As I recall, Peter was warned that he was going to betray Christ, but he didn't do it all at once. Remember? He's following along at a distance. You start there. Following a little too far behind Jesus. And then he starts at the courtyards and warming his hands by the fire. And pretty soon, he's denying and denying with an oath. And praise God for roosters to call us back. To remember, sin never starts big. It always starts small and grows. We've got to stamp it out quick. I bought a garden implement. I did. I had never owned one. I had my grandmother's implement for destroying weeds. I can't call them by their name anymore. Yeah, and so hers was triangular. I've always wanted one, but I haven't seen one since. And I finally bought one, and I'm behind. I've been going out there and chopping all the weeds in my flower bed, and we've gotten some rain, and now I kind of was curious, and this was a science experiment for myself. I was thinking, surely I don't have this many of the same kind of weed all growing in this flower bed that I've inherited. They must be a flower. There's no flower. They're just ugly, noxious weeds. I got to get out there because I've let them get away from me. It's going to be a chore and hours of time, and well, not hours, but it's going to be not a 5-second chop like it was whenever I first bought that implement. Now it's going to be tomorrow, about 20 minutes worth, and then I'm going to have to turn over all those dead weeds in there. I'm probably just going to have to rake them out and put them in one of those paper bags. You let it grow, and it'll grow. Left alone, sin grows. Children may falter, and roses may falter, but somehow my weeds grow like crazy. This lesson, I just can't leave alone. It's verse 6. John chapter 12 and verse 6. Those who measure life and success only in dollars and cents sometimes steal them. Who's the fellow who's can only see the waste? 300 denarii. And don't ridicule that number. That's a big number. Remember, Jesus uses the denarius as a day's wage. Whenever the servants went in, whenever the laborers were hired to go out into the field at different times in the day, and Jesus gave that parable, each was promised a denarius, and the master paid each one the denarius. There was nothing wrong with paying a man a denarius for an entire hard, back-breaking day's work. And this was worth 300 of them. How much are you going to pay a day laborer now? $50? At least. What's 300 of his days worth? $15,000. And remember, the buying power here is going to be just as great or greater when you think about those necessities of life they had to have. Would you break something that was worth $15,000 that was gone immediately? I hope for Jesus we would. But here, fertile ground for criticism. But if we just look at the dollars and cents, if we only see the waste, we've got to remember, sacrifice isn't waste. Whenever they burned those magic books in Ephesus, that was exactly what they needed to do, no matter how much they were worth. They needed to be destroyed, not sold in the marketplace or sent on to some other sorcerer. They needed to turn away from that sorcery and destroy them. That wasn't waste. That was sacrifice. And there's no waste to Jesus going to the cross and spilling every drop of his precious blood there. That is sacrifice. So hard sometimes to get my students to see the value of sacrifice. They just want to laugh at someone who gave their life for a cause that they don't understand. Judas didn't understand either. And that was because he could only see the 300 denarius that, by the way, didn't go into his money bag, which wasn't his anyway. I think we can take a great lesson from Mary here as well. And please don't take this wrong at all. But our fourth lesson this evening, I think we should find here in verse 7. I think we need to give some flowers some of the time while our brothers and sisters can smell them. Thank you, Mike. I see you for all those flowers. Thank you, Brother Tinius, Bob. Thank you for all those flowers. They're so wonderful. It's so great to have them. I'll tell you what, I don't understand those doghouse cards at the florist shop. If you're going to give flowers because you're in trouble, it's too late, brother. You need to give those flowers while you're not in trouble. Whenever you can write that silly note that John wrote, that's a great one. I don't remember exactly the word for word, but boy, John can remember it, and Sister Cassidy can remember those exact words of that Fort Worth note. That's a Fort Worth note, as far as I'm concerned. There's going to be sacrifice just like this given in only a few days. Before the week is out, somebody else is going to break some alabaster boxes, and there will be 100 pounds worth of spices that'll cost just as much as this or more, wrapped lovingly around Jesus' body. And he'll know, not because he's alive at that moment, but he'll be resurrected and be able to appreciate those spices. But let's remember, be sure you're sharing love now with others. How often do we cry, Absalom, my son, because it's not just our loss, but our regret of what we haven't done for them. Let's make sure we live and part every time we leave a mate or a loved one saying, I love you, so that those are the last words we say, because one of these days they will be the last words we give. Let's make sure we don't go to bed angry, because some folks don't wake up in the morning. Let's make sure we live every day knowing one of these moments is going to be our last. We've got to remember James's warning. Come to now, you who say, we'll go into such and such a city and buy and sell and get gain. You don't know if you'll even live. You ought to say what? If the Lord wills, we'll both live and do this or that. James chapter 4, verses 13 through 15. Remember the young and the old prophets? I just love some of these somewhat obscure Bible stories in the Old Testament. None of them are obscure, but if you read 1 Kings chapter 13, beginning in verse 27, through verse 33, there's just this marvelous story told. It's a chilling story told, really, about a great prophet of God who's sent up from Judah and goes to cry against the new altar that's been set up at Bethel. One's been set up at Dan and another at Bethel to try to make sure that the northern kingdom stays in Jeroboam's hands. And Jeroboam himself is offering sacrifice on that altar. And he stretches his hand out to seize the prophet, and his hand withers. And the prophet prays, and his hand is restored. A miracle takes place. And on the way back, an old prophet hears about this, and he's so anxious, it seems, to talk to another prophet of God that he tells him a lie. He was commanded not to eat or drink and make no pauses on his journey and go straight back home. But the old prophet told him, the Lord told me to send you a message and have you come into my home. He believed it, and then the old prophet himself gives the message. God gives another prophecy through this old prophet saying you will not reach home. And sure enough, the prophet's son finds the young prophet killed by a lion, but not molested, with that animal just keeping watch. If I remember all the details of the story, just keeping watch there at the roadside. This wild animal, having killed him, didn't eat any part of the carcass. So the old prophet takes him and with great lamentations buries him. There's nothing wrong with crying at funerals. There is nothing wrong with flowers for funerals. There's nothing wrong with laying food on the graveside. That may not be our customs, but I remember in Southern California, a very wise elder, there was some brethren with a Asian background that was their custom, was to present a fine meal and put it on the gravestones. And someone said to him, "They're not going to be able to eat that meal, are they?" And he said, "No better than they can smell your flowers." Let's leave the flowers. Let's honor the dead. This is Memorial Day. Let's be sure to remember those who sacrificed for us. But let's also shake the hand of a veteran. Let's also let people know I love you and appreciate you every single day. And make sure our mourning is for our loss, not over our guilt. Finally, I'm not the Apostle Paul. Whenever I say finally, that doesn't mean I'm 1/3 into the lesson. Finally, notice verse 8. You do not have me with you always, Jesus says. Buy up the time. Buying up the time for the days are evil. Have you ever heard opportunity knocking, but by the time you could unset the alarm and take off the deadbolt and remove the chain and get 3 locks open and get the door open, finally you've gone on to the next house. We've got to strike sometimes and do something. Anything. That I don't recall seeing the movie, but I love the title of a teenage movie that was a little bit, I'm too old for it. Say anything. If I got the gist of the plot very well, it was about a young man who wanted a date with a girl and couldn't get up the courage and finally had to learn just to say anything. Anything is so much better than nothing at all. I remember going on a Bible study with a young man named Rick, and he was the star pupil of the evangelism teacher. And I really wanted to go with him. In fact, we were going on campaign together and in a large group, and usually we would take one of the brethren with us, and so we would go out alone with one of the brethren there, but I asked, could I come with you? And so we took one of the brethren with us, and I got to go with Rick as well. And boy, he did know every single tactic in that lessons we've learned, how to make sure that people that they didn't have a chance to raise objections to baptism beforehand. He took care of their objections first. He knew how to close the sale, Knew all the techniques that I didn't know, and I was afraid I was going to mess this up. I'm going to make some terrible mistake. I'm going to have some soul that would become a Christian if only Rick taught them, but if I do it, oh boy, I'm going to say it wrong. I'm going to do it wrong. And I remember we went through about a half hour of those things, and he did it right. He followed everything in the books, and he just made these folks feel terrible. They had a little child and said, don't you want your little child to follow you into heaven? And he finally asked them, can we go to the building in your car or mine to be baptized? And the lady went, I'm glad you finally asked. I've been waiting for a half an hour for you to ask me. If the word's been taught, say something. Say anything. Just the most eloquent sermon ever to one of the hardest audiences is in John the 1st chapter. Come and see. Come and see. Just come on with me. Say anything. What a privilege to recline at the table with Lazarus and Jesus, to smell that perfume and learn something from Judas's complaints and our Lord's loving rebuke. Remember, the devil's going to get you if he can. No good deed ever goes unpunished, but that's by the devil. Remember, don't let the little sins grow. It's the little foxes, the wise man said, that spoil the vineyard. Make sure you remember, measure life in more than just dollars and cents, so that you're not tempted to pocket any that don't belong to you. Keep on giving flowers to those who can't smell them too. But don't forget to give those flowers to people who can still smell them. And remember, tick, 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 tick. It's running. We've only got a few more days to be filled with praise and to tell the old story. Buy up that time. This is one more time. We're going to sing a song. And if you need to redeem this moment by being baptized into Christ Jesus for the forgiveness of your sins, or giving us the opportunity, the privilege of giving you some flowers and praying with you and for you this evening, please give us that chance. Let us know how we can help you by coming as we stand and as we sing.